Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today is the third episode in a series about dependency and dependent personality disorder. I'm going to be talking about development, and not just abnormal development. All these developmentally focused episodes on personality disorders, we include the normal level of development. This is important just to differentiate between what is more problematic and what is within the normal range, and it's particularly important in the day and age of the internet where anybody can research anything, and it's very easy to ascribe symptoms to ourselves even when we might not have that condition. So we'll talk first about normal developments, and then we'll tread into what do we know about the abnormal development behind dependency and dependent personality disorder. So when it comes to normal development, dependency is really normal. I mean, we talk about other personality disorders. You can see my other episodes on normal and abnormal development for those different personality disorders. But dependency is like synonymous with human existence. Like, this isn't even a defense system. Dependency is what we are born into. We are dependent as infants upon caregivers to some degree. And so the task in life is not to eliminate dependency. I think there is sometimes confusion around this. So like, well, we start dependent, but at the end, we end up completely independent. It's like, au contraire. What we look for is the yin and the yang, that we begin with dependency, we explore independence, and then we look for a balance between those two. Because we start with dependency, it is one of our most primal needs, and we have to healthily move through that phase to get to healthy levels of independence. A different way of saying it is independence is contingent upon healthy degrees of dependency. Now, if we were use different language than dependency, because dependency often has a negative connotation, we're basically talking about attachment here. That what we're looking for is a good enough attachment. I don't like this idea of a secure attachment, because who the heck is securely attached? Well, generally speaking, a good enough attachment to foster a sense of self-exploration independent of a powerful other, so that we can gain insight into ourselves independent of people and increase our independence in this world. It is the path that all of us take. So it's important to start with that aspect of the conversation before proceeding any further. Now, the next obvious question might be, well, that doesn't really answer the question. Like, what's like a healthy level of dependency versus a not so healthy level of dependency? Good, touche. Good question. Perhaps you're learning this about me if you've seen other episodes and other series. For me, I like to use metaphor and imagery. There's kind of two. I've got a favorite that I'll use, but I'll go with a different one first. So think of a healthy level of dependency as like, we exist on a sailboat. We're all out on a sailboat in this vast sea known as life. We like to think, we try our best to create solid ground in this life, but in reality, we're in the unpredictable, stormy seas. There's no way around that. Life can never be that predictable. And what dependency does for us, especially early on, it's the shore to which our ship can return when either one, we're needing to restock and recuperate, or when a problem comes up that we're needing to triage or troubleshoot. And so very early on, we're returning to those shores very frequently. It's very important for us to do so. Healthy levels of attachment allow us to do this too. We go out on our own, we test quite a bit, and then we come back to the shores and say, hey, how'd that go? Help me out with this, et cetera, et cetera. And I talk about this in my Change Over Time episode, that even within the therapeutic frame and therapy itself, clients are relying on providers often for these safe shores to which they can return. As we continue to age and grow, we need to return to the shore a little bit less. We construct a bigger boat, it holds more food, we can visit other continents, and things go relatively well. But at the end of the day, we need a place to which we can return. That never ends. It never ends. It does not matter how old we get. We need that shore to which we can return. Now, I should note, the degree to which we need to return to the shore varies person to person. For some of us, we just kind of jump into the bay. Well, don't jump into the bay. We drive. You don't drive. You sail. There we go. I got there eventually. You sail into the dock. You shouldn't sail into the dock. You dock at the shore. I'm not a boat person at this juncture, but you're at the dock for 30 minutes. You do a quick restock. You say hi to people, and then you peace out, and out you go. And that's okay. There are certain people in this world that very small moments of connection are quite sufficient for them. Or using the real world analog, they have a couple close connections, and they don't require a lot of emotional support or even time with these individuals to feel sufficiently safe and resourced to go back out there. Totally normal. That's okay. We're not talking about the counter-dependent people who are like, I hate going to the dock. I'm never going to go to the dock. I don't want to talk to anybody on the dock. I mean, we're just talking about people with a different preference. There are also those that will go to the dock and they will stay ashore for weeks. And that's their process of recuperating. And that does not, depict like an unhealthy level of dependency. Some of us just have more relational, emotional needs. And so they're going to need more time. Or using the real world analog, they'll have 3 people in their lives that they're fielding with and they need to talk to about their emotions and their concerns before they feel confident to go sail the seas once again. And that's okay. That is okay. It is when we return to the shores so frequently that we're barely ever out at sea, or importantly, with dependency, you never want to sail the ship yourself. You are terrified of leaving the shore, and you will only leave the shore when a more powerful other, the person who owns the boat, takes you onto their boat and takes you out into the sea. You are never your own captain. That is very different. That is an unhealthy level of dependency. And you'll notice there's some variance, right? There's maybe sailing out on your own, but you don't go very far, or you like burn through your supplies in 2 seconds flat and you're back on shore before you know it. 2 straight up, you're never sailing yourself. You're never sailing yourself. The other metaphor that I more commonly use, particularly when I'm talking to folks about like codependency, is thinking of trees within a forest. The reality is trees are healthier in at least some degree of a cloister, a forest. They are at their best in a forest because they are, at the end of the day, a communal creature. Not to the degree we are, obviously, but they are healthier in numbers. A forest is far healthier than a tree that stands on its own. And this is basically depicting what healthy dependency is. The forest makes sense. We're supposed to be there. We are relational creatures by nature. And if you've ever seen, or I don't know, I've never seen it, I guess, but you think about the forming of a forest, that is not an easy task. To have all these individual sproutlings trying to make it essentially on their own because they can't help each other yet is an overwhelming task. It is very challenging to do. Similarly, when you see very developed forests, it's why trees on the periphery grow quite slowly. You do not see an exponential rapid expansion of a forest because the trees that are on the outliers, they're subjected to more dangers than the trees that are in the denser forest. Now, the reality, though, is even within the forest, trees cannot be too densely packed together. A tree is strongest when it is amongst others, but it still is standing on its own and has its own space. And so, when we talk about healthy dependency, we want to exist in this forest. Again, to a varying degree. Certain trees are fine being 20 yards out. It's cool, right? Like you're allowed to do that. And just as well, some people really want packed dense forests. Some trees prefer cloistering closer together. Scrub oaks are a good example of a weird tree-like bush thing that, you can prune them to create a tree, but they grow very densely, and that's okay too. The challenge, though, when we talk about dependency, is when a tree grows right next to another tree. And many people will confuse. Trees can grow wonky and look like they're 2 trees when they're actually one, but if 2 trees sprout too closely together, they will meld their trunks in a way that looks super solid, but is actually quite structurally unsound. They are not as strong when they are melded together in such a way. That is a type of dependency that is quite dangerous because then one tree becomes, now this is where it falls apart a little bit, codependent on the other tree. Now, dependent personality disorder, independent of codependency, is, I think I said before, it's kind of like a pilot fish attaching to a shark or, some sort of larger creature. And quite similarly, if we were to apply this forest metaphor, it would be a bigger, stronger tree that the other tree kind of wraps itself around as a means of like, all right, I'm good as long as I'm closer to this bigger tree. But the point being, the essence of this metaphor is that a tree is at its best when it can stand alone, but still amongst others. If you are practicing that in your life, you're probably okay. But if you are finding yourself, whether it is never leaving the shores or wrapping yourself around the trunk of a bigger tree, you might be in trouble. So that's kind of the more abstract-y, and see if you can apply it to yourself sort of thing. That I don't know if it's helpful, but for whatever that's worth. So that's kind of the normal or abnormal described through metaphor, etc. I will note as we tread towards the abnormal and we talk about the degrees of severity, this is the psychodynamic theory that eventually our diagnostic manual will pick up on and say like, hey, it's not you either have a disorder or you don't, there's varying degrees. The varying degrees can present quite differently for dependent personality disorder. And the neurotic ones are incredibly hard to detect. Why? Well, we just talked about it. Dependency is a part of the human condition. And so if you have mild levels of unhealthy dependency, you might not see it until their relationships are compromised. And relationships, if people do generally well in life, it's very hard to discern when like, oh, okay, well, yeah, nobody doesn't like to have friends or nobody likes to go through a nasty breakup. Of course, they're going to, want to go out there and have supports or, they're really emotional and they're leaning on me. Okay, it's really hard to detect. And so usually, anecdotally, is my experience, is you start to see this sadly later in life. Because as we get older, our relationships are increasingly compromised. And whether it's because of deaths or estrangements or whatever it might be, never mind the amalgam of experiences to finally recognize that there's a trend here. Dependency can come up. And even that is hard to differentiate because we talk about death. Well, what's the difference between a grieving process and dependency, a dependent reaction to loss? Devil's in the details here, but I'm not going to be of much help when it comes to the more neurotic levels. All I can say is like what you would get with a more neurotic thing is basically more like an insecure attachment in general. Those of us who are a little bit more insecurely attached to others are tend to be quite fearful of loss of relationship and loss of affection. That doesn't always mean that they feel like they can't stand on their own 2 feet. Just that that sort of uncertainty because a relationship is jeopardized or has been lost is quite palpable. This is one of the arguments, I think, floating around that there's been questions sometimes of the legitimacy of dependent personality disorder, and it's probably because it's so diffuse in that way. Like, if we're talking about a neurotic higher functioning dependency, if it's synonymous with any sort of attachment issue, well, like what? Not any sort, but like the more insecure attachments. What exactly are we talking about here? Side note again, my apologies. Technically, insecure attachments are correlated with all sorts of personality disorders, so it's not just like unique to dependency. You can see it load on to various things. So you would still want to see at the core these fears of being alone, and particularly that attachment, the passivity within relationships, and then the attachment to more powerful others as being a central drive, that I am weak and frail, and other people are more powerful. It's probably the easiest way to identify a more neurotic level is there's that theme tends to come up. Versus just fear of loss, well, that's its own thing. There's not like a self-esteem power dynamic there. As we go down severity level, though, you're going to see this very pervasively. You're getting towards the diagnostic manual version of this, the current diagnostic manual of this, and you tend to see it earlier on in life too. And this is where we're starting to tread into, arguments of like, what do we know about the development? Because you will often have temperamental components and you'll have lots of relational attachment and insecurity issues throughout childhood to varying degrees, and then it doesn't get better. Often what's really important in this, kind of harking back to normal versus abnormal development, depending on the family system, depending on the culture, speaking of culture is a big thing, When a kid finally launches out of a family environment, that is the true test. And you will see often shifts out of dependency by virtue of them being forced out of a situation that condones dependency. Adulthood is not copacetic, generally speaking, with dependency. And so if they shift, even if it's a little bit messy, when they're out on their own and they're 18 and above or 16 and above, depending culturally where you're at, then it's probably not dependency. However, a dependent personality disorder, particularly the lower levels of organization, they will launch, but they will be a failure to launch. They will not do better, and they will continue to struggle without sufficient strong attachments in their life that they can kind of attach to, sufficiently strong people to which they can wed themselves and feel sufficiently safe and become passive with and let them dictate their lives, etc., etc. So you'll see that very pervasively. I mentioned culture, but I'll leave that to the end here as far as normal versus abnormal development kind of stuff. And let's just get into what do we know. Now, as usual, my unfortunate answer anytime we have an episode on personality disorders, well, we're not 100% sure. And so here we are yet again. And more than typically, we're going to see a mixture of nature and nurture, environment and biology, or let's reverse that to be consistent, biology and environment. And dependency likely follows a similar course. Now, there's a little bit less clarity on the temperament biological side, but anecdotally, in meeting folks who I believe had dependent personality disorder, never mind my psychological assessment, I tend to see people cloistering around other like internalizing, insecure, high sensitivity types of personalities. So the depressive personalities, the more masochistic versions, the kind of anxious or avoidant personalities, they tend to all kind of be very sensitive individuals. Borderline personality disorder is another one, but it's got its own kind of unique both end, hence the term. And so I very much bargain that temperament is a piece and that heightened sensitivity is a piece. But more of the research is targeted at environments, at least the support around the environment. But even that is not terribly distinct. So the two that are relatively well supported is two types of parenting styles that tend to lend themselves towards the development of dependent personality disorder. One is like the helicopter parenting. These are the on top of the kids constantly. And that should make some intuitive sense because essentially it's teaching the kid, hey, you can't be trusted to do this on your own. You need me, the powerful, knowledgeable other, to insert themselves or insert myself and make sure that you are safe and make sure that you are okay. And it never really gives the kid the opportunity to even encounter independence, never mind, going back to the theory around temperament, if they're a particularly sensitive and sheepish kid, you pair that with a helicopter parent, they're not going to push themselves out of that situation terribly well. They will fall into that trap more easily. This is where it's really interesting. If you get a different temperament, you can get kids who rebel against the helicopter parent. And they can even look like they're misbehaving, but it's developmentally appropriate and quite protective against developing dependent tendencies to rebel against the helicopter parent. Because it's like, no, leave me alone. I need to figure this out on my own. And that's incredibly important when parents are suffocating the kid. Now, there's a second parenting style. You're like, great. So what parenting style doesn't hurt dependency? Any bad parenting style hurts, risk development of dependency. Okay. An authoritarian. Authoritarian is like the very controlling, not in like a helicopter way, but kind of in a dismissive, not terribly emotionally sensitive way. And this, again, kind of delegitimizes a kid's feelings. Not again, but, what this does is it delegitimizes kids' feelings, and it's this very powerful other that dictates right and wrong. And importantly, they often send this message, authoritarian parents, that there is a right way and a wrong way. And that provokes a fear response, especially out of sensitive kids, that like, oh, shoot, I got to get it right. And with that fear of getting things wrong, they tend to be more passive, more kind of pulled back, and they will look to others for answers, be like, help me understand what the right way is. And it sets a dangerous precedent that can continue forward. Now, latent to both of these, a little bit less on the helicopter side, more on the authoritarian side, is the potential for trauma, or independent of parenting style, trauma technically can be correlated. And this is especially true for young childhood trauma, sexual traumas, and those sorts of things, because they're massive violations of trust. And they really mess with people's understanding of safety and their own power and competency in the world. And so if someone sees themselves as, lacking in any power or lacking in any sort of competency, it makes sense that there is a potential pathway towards dependency, because they're like, well, if I can't secure that, I need to find someone who can. And you will often get a very avoidant, a simultaneously avoidant methodology here, where they are interpersonally aversive and they will avoid most situations out of the fear of what that could mean, that they could subject themselves to dangerous or unhealthy or unsafe situations. But because we are relational creatures, they will attach themselves to the few powerful others that they can find as a source of support and nurturance moving forward, and hence dependency plays out. Trying to think here, I've got some notes to make sure. Yeah, that's relatively solid. What's interesting too is there's some trends with like opposite gender parents. Again, we're talking about biological sex here, where the opposite parent tends to all right, how do I unwind this? Sexuality is a thing too. So my problem with these studies is like it presumes sexuality in a way. And so just note that before I go into this. so like, heteronormative kind of ideology here, so forgive me, is like the relationship with the opposite gender parent, or one might wonder what ends up being the point of attraction, albeit if bisexuality is a thing, then what? But anyway, I digress. Probably then it's about the father, because we are still in a very kind of masculine forward. The parent, the father has more control and more power, but I digress. The opposite gender parent, if they in particular have a certain methodology of parenting, they are more likely to impact the development of dependency than the same gender parent. So like if your born sex is like male, and you have this like authoritarian kind of dick father, excuse my French, that's less likely to develop dependency than if you have like a helicopter mom and or like a really authoritarian, controlling, and emotionally detached mother, and then vice versa. And then, you talk about, well, what about same-sex parents? And well, then it might fall along masculinity versus femininity roles within that couple, and or, maybe it's about, attraction, what you are most attracted to, and whatever is that gender of parent might dictate that, if that made any sense in anything I said. But it's just kind of an interesting aside that when we talk about parenting, the research doesn't say unilaterally if you got one parent that does this, you're screwed. There is a potential skew, at least as it currently stands, towards opposite gender parents. So there you go, for whatever that's worth. So I will note too that regardless of parenting style, like a lot of this blame, it can feel like blame placed on the parent, and parents have a big role. But what's really interesting is the temperament of the kid can also influence what parenting style is used. And basically think of this as like, it could be a clash if you're watching video, me hit my fists together, just like a mismatch of temperaments between parent and child. So say like a parent, let's start with the kid. Let's say a kid is a highly sensitive kid, but the parent's temperament and or life experiences say, I don't like needy people, right? I don't like overly emotional people. And so that kid could maybe benefit, not from coddling, right? You don't want a helicopter. That's an opposite problem, but that's what, let me say it that way. Some parents might helicopter and go, oh no, so sensitive, and they overly coddle. and they become the helicopter parent as a kind of by virtue of their kid's temperament. Now, again, they've got their own stuff that feeds into why they made that choice, but that can be a thing. And simultaneously, while they might not act this way with a more securely attached, less sensitive kid, a really sensitive kid can provoke a more rejecting or a more controlling vibe from a parent. So there's these, you're not blaming the kid for this. Temperament is not something that the kid can control, but it's another variable in why parental styles show up. They are sometimes, in part, a response to the kid's temperament. And so if you're like an early parent listening to this, know thyself. This is essentially the call to action, is like, if you have a hard time with a lot of sensitivity, you got a sensitive kid, be careful. And that can be, I don't like sensitivity, to, oh gosh, I like to coddle and caretake things to make sure everything's okay. And I'm always trying to make sure everything's okay. You got to be careful, because a sensitive kid is going to evoke those reactions out of you more so than a kid that is not as sensitive. So just kind of bearing that in mind. All right, I think that's it. As I fumbled my way through the opposite sex gender one, and then the attachment stuff, or the temperament stuff. So let me just recap, just to make sure you can kind of make sense of all the things I just said. Parenting style, or let's start. Temperament matters, and temperament influences parental style. The parental styles that are typically associated with dependency tend to be kind of the helicopter parent and or the authoritarian controlling parent. And then noting that while if both parents are having a hard time, probably not a good thing, but the opposite, as it currently stands, the opposite sex gender parent tends to have more influence on the development of dependency, albeit we're not 100% sure when we think about people with same-sex parents or differences in, like, say, sexual identity and how does that intersect. I don't think we're terribly sure on that stuff yet. And it could, technically speaking, follow the same lines, even with those differences. We just don't know. So that's the kind of research, for whatever that's worth, the recap of the research. Now let's end with one final note, one final curiosity. And this is about culture. I could have technically loaded that up earlier when we were talking about normal versus abnormal development, but it bears mentioning that, especially if you're a provider, your culture will dictate what dependency looks like. Because remember, we talked about dependency is synonymous with existence. I don't care what culture you're from. Dependency exists, but how you encounter what constitutes healthy versus unhealthy dependency is very much shaped by the culture within which you were raised, whether it's the unique family culture or the greater culture and system within which you exist. The easiest example of this is comparing collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. Collectivistic cultures put a big premium on how one's personal world is intrinsically, is immediately tied to the experiences of the collective whole. There are pros and cons to this. On the bright side, it provides a lot of sense of cohesion, and there tends to be a bigger sort of connection with other people, or at least the potential for that. It doesn't always pan out. Sometimes people are in their own corners despite the collectivistic urges. The con of it, though, is that it can be suffocating to the individual. Well, regardless of the pros and cons, it's going to mess with our concept of dependency. Because somebody from a collectivistic culture could talk about an undue fear of negatively influencing their behavior, negatively influencing the experiences of another person. If we're not holding culture in mind, we might inadvertently begin to believe that person has dependent personality disorder when, to a certain degree, you can ascribe this to culture. Much like here in individualistic cultures, I say here in the States where I exist, it's very easy to define unhealthy levels of dependency because we're very independent, we're very independent people. It's just like, you can't stand on your own 2 feet. You care a lot too much about what other people think. That's not good. And in a way, we could potentially over-identify dependency because we're so individualistic, but we come with our own pros and cons. It celebrates the individual independent of other people. Yet simultaneously, there's a lot of disconnection. If not, it jeopardizes healthy dependency because of, too much emphasis on independence. And so when we talk about like, is dependency, a construct that would exist independent of culture, or is it one of the most culturally driven personality issues out there? I don't know. If you could create some sort of utopian society where there's a whatever this, I don't even know what this looks like, but a very solid balance between collectivism and individualism, would dependency exist? I really don't know. I can't answer that question. I think it's just an interesting and unique hypothetical, because if someone has, regardless of the, they're all temperaments have a place to go if you find a balance between those two. And so if there's somebody who's more sensitive and more inclined to develop dependency, and you exist, I mean, it's almost like a non-statement, like utopian anything could solve a lot of problems. But anyway, if you have this, like, okay, we're going to allow for more dependency, and simultaneously we're still going to push you in a way that encourages a healthy degree of independence, would dependency ever really come up? Because there's enough fluidity between those two that all people have a place. I don't know. Was dependency on Star Trek? I don't think so. I never saw anybody who was dependent. It's probably a non-point. I mean, it's human personality. It just is what it is. We'll always find a way to have somebody, further in the extreme, and it doesn't matter how perfect we are. Something will mess up and spur on, dependency fears, and then that's whatever the version of dependent personality would be in that particular, sci-fi hypothetical situation. I guess at the end of the day, the more important point is pay attention to the culture within which you were raised if you are curious about dependency, and or if you are a provider, trying to figure out if someone might have a dependency problem or a dependent personality disorder. Just be sure you're paying attention to upbringing, the culture and context within which the upbringing occurred. So, oh my goodness, this felt like a packed episode, but I think that's it. So hopefully helpful, the normal and abnormal development with some metaphors / imagery that maybe will help kind of differentiate between what could constitute a healthy degree of dependency versus an unhealthy degree. A little bit of information about what we know can be correlated with the development of dependent personality disorder, and then some final comments on culture. So be sure to stick around for future episodes. I'm at least doing one on treatments. I'm forgetting if there's another one on my list. We will have to see. But as always, I appreciate you watching and or listening, and stay curious.